Nice to see you again. This is the fifth in our series of lectures on the history of Mattapoisett. Last time we did shipbuilding. Before that we did the Revolution and the War of 1812. But one of the things that paralleled the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the beginning of the shipbuilding era here in Mattapoisett was the salt industry, the solar salt industry. And it's very interesting how I got into it. This is actually a little talk unto itself that I have done a number of times to various groups, and it comes from my master's thesis that I wrote down at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut back in the mid-60s. And how did this all come about that I'd write about the solar salt industry? And what we mean by solar salt industry is the evaporation of seawater to get the salt to use. And I got into it because I was, as I say, I was doing my master's degree at Trinity College in Hartford, and I was taking a graduate course from a Dr. Weaver. And the lecture that day had been up on Connecticut and how Connecticut really was a provider state, since the Connecticut River ran right up through it into Massachusetts. It enabled the vessels of all types to come from New York, Boston, Long Island Sound, and up the river and trade with, bring goods and produce to both Connecticut and Massachusetts. And so Connecticut was the provider state, as it was called at that time. And Dr. Weaver made the statement several times that the barrels of fish were heavily salted to preserve them, as well as meats and poultry. And I got to thinking, well, that must have taken a lot of salt. Now, where did they get all of that salt to use to preserve these food goods? And as I was thinking about it, I remembered that in my grandmother's attic here in Mattapoisett, or at that time I was in Connecticut, up in Mattapoisett, Massachusetts, up in my grandmother's attic, and that was in the Purrington house right up here on Main Street. In one of the back rooms on the third floor was what looked like a little village with all these little huts with pyramid-type roofs. And I remember asking my father what that was, and he told me it was the model of a salt works that my Uncle Ellis had made in 1907 for the semi-centennial celebration of the town, the 50th celebration of the separation, as you know, of Mattapoisett from the township of Rochester back in 1857. And there had been quite a few salt works here in Mattapoisett and all around Buzzards Bay and out on the Cape. And so I got to thinking about it, and of course I tuned back into Dr. Weaver's lecture, and the class ended, and I went up to him afterwards, and I said I was thinking when we were talking about the barrels of foodstuff that were preserved with salt, and wondering where they got the salt. I said, do you know where it came from? And he paused and he said, well, now that is a very interesting question. I never really thought about that, where they got the salt. And so I proceeded to tell him about my great Uncle Ellis and the model of salt works up in my grandmother's attic. And he stopped me and he said, well, now that sounds like a good thesis topic. And of course, back in those days, for a master's degree, particularly in history, you had to write a thesis, 100 or more pages. And he said, why don't you research it and see what you can come up with, and I'll gladly work with you. So I suddenly had a job to do and a challenge. And so I began researching a bit and found that, oh yes, salt was a very important commodity all through man's history, from the earliest beginning, so to speak, way back to the Egyptians, if not before, the Chinese and the Greeks and the Romans. All used a great amount of salt. As a matter of fact, salt in some cases was used as a currency in the Roman army, for example. And then my wife Alice and I were on a trip, 10, 12 years ago, a river trip over in Europe, and we were on the Danube River. And one of the little towns that the boat we were on stopped in, I can't remember the name of the little town, but we went ashore, and right across the top of one of the buildings, a long sign showed a convoy of barges being towed up the river, and they were loaded with salt. And believe it or not, all the rivers of Europe, of course, were used for trade, as they are in this country, Mississippi, for example. And the produce that was carried most frequently on these up and down the rivers several hundred years ago in Europe, and earlier probably, one of the staples was salt, cloth, lumber, and wine. Those are usually the cargo that was made up on these barges. All right. Now, how does that all fit into what we really want to talk about tonight? The solar evaporation of salt, of seawater to get salt. And so we go back to the colonial period where we started 4 or 5 lectures ago in the early 1600s, back to the Plymouth colony and the Bay colony, and found that yes, salt was a much desired commodity because it was used to preserve fish, beef, and pork. And if you didn't have salt, you couldn't preserve these items, and they would spoil. Now, I took a great deal of salt. I wanted to find out how much, so I did a little research. And for example, a British fishing boat fishing up in the North Sea, a vessel 60 to 80 feet long, something like our Nova Scotia fishing schooners that we're more familiar with here in New England. Back in the 1600s, one vessel, all right, used about 2,000 bushels of salt a year. 2,000 bushels. I mean, you know what a bushel looks like. That's so big around and so high. 2,000 bushels a year, or 5.5 bushels of salt a day to cure the fish or preserve the fish. And how did they do that? Well, just very quickly, right on the deck of these fishing vessels, fishing schooners or sloops, they had like a big sandbox, right, amidships, like a big sandbox, but it's filled full of salt, maybe 6 to 8 inches high, and maybe 8 feet square. And the fish would be brought up in the smaller boats, as you may have read about or seen pictures of, and were thrown up onto the deck of the fishing vessel, and where they were beheaded and gutted and cleaned, and then they were thrown into this sandbox of salt box really, and were stirred around. And this went on all day. Then at night, they were taken out of that salt box, washed down with salt water, and packed in barrels, right? And a layer of salt at the bottom of the barrel, and then the fish were laid in, not thrown in, laid in one layer at a time, tails in, and the bodies out. As you can see, they would fit in, and you could load up the barrel. A layer of fish, layer of salt, layer of fish, layer of salt, right up to the top. And then the cask was headed up, as they would call it, and it was ready to take into port. Now, if the fish were going to be shipped overseas or any great distance at all, they were unpacked, and that same procedure in the barrel was done for a second time. And if this was done, it was felt that the fish would last 5 to 6 months. You would have your salt fish. It took 1 barrel of salt for 3 barrels of fish, this process I've talked about. So if you have 3 barrels packed with fish, the way I have outlined, you had to have 1 whole barrel of salt in order to do that. So we're talking a large quantity of salt, but of course fish was a main ingredient of diet, particularly of Catholics throughout the world and throughout Europe. All right, now back to our colonies. In the Plymouth colony, both Governor Bradford and then Governor Winthrop were very concerned about salt. Salt was needed, and so they imported salters. A salter is somebody who makes salt. Salters from England. And in England, they make salt by boiling it in kettles. But that's a back-breaking process unless you have a heavy brine. Now in England, the way they made their salt was not from seawater, but inland salt deposits through the kind of the center of England. The Witches, there was North Witch, South Witch, Middle Witch, Up Witch, and a whole band of these little towns, and they were right on top of what we call a salt plug or a salt dome left over from an ancient sea. We have the same thing down in Texas. What we're doing with those now, of course, is storing atomic waste in them. But here in England, what they would do would divert a stream and down into a pit that they had dug into the salt and run the water down in there, dilute or get the salt into a mixture, that a brine, a heavy brine, that they could then pump out and put in a kettle, build a fire, and boil it. But it was a very concentrated brine. And that's the way they made it in England. But over here, we hadn't gone inland far enough to get to our inland deposits, which we would eventually by 1800 in Ohio and New York State. Great salt deposits. And of course now, of course, way out west, Great Salt Lake, we get a lot of our salt from those areas. But so only source of a salt brine, so to speak, that we had here in the colonies in the early 1600s was our salt water. However, since it was not a concentrate, wasn't a concentrated brine of salt, it took 350 gallons of Mattapoisett Harbor water to make 1 bushel of salt. And when you think that you would have to carry that bucket by bucket up to a kettle over a fire and boil it away, you're talking an unbelievable amount of effort and time and manpower. Plus, what about the fire to boil 350 gallons of water? Well, it took 1 cord of wood. A cord, you know, is 8 feet long, 4 feet high, and 4 feet wide. It took a whole cord of wood to make 6 bushels of salt. So right away we can see that these salters that came over from England and tried to make salt the way that they made it over there, it wasn't going to work. There was another process that they used over in Europe, the French used, particularly along the Bay of Biscay in southern France there. They have these marshes and that are very, what shall I, flat, and they would dam them up at high tide, and at low tide the water would stay and they would keep it there until the sun evaporated all away and the water away, and then they would scrape out the salt. This was not a very pure salt, but it was another process. And this process is used even today in areas where they have made clean basins, so to speak, in certain areas of Spain, around the Mediterranean, for example, and even down in the Caribbean in some areas. Well, look at our shore here of Buzzards Bay and see where we could do that sort of thing. Well, our soil, as we know, is very gravelly and rocky and sandy here, and so the water wouldn't stay. When the tide, it just drains down into the soil, and it's gone. Plus the fact our weather isn't conducive to evaporation much of the time. It's damp and it's cold and it's wet. So, real problem. We don't seem to be able to make our own salt. So what did we do? What were we doing to get our salt? Well, very simply, we imported it. We imported it from Europe, from Britain, from France, from the Caribbean. It was brought over by the hundreds of thousands of bushels, really. It was used as ballast in the ships as they came over, because of the trade was kind of lopsided between the colonies here in the New World and Europe, the mother countries. We were shipping bulk cargo over, and they were shipping finished goods back, like axes and window glass and that sort of thing. So they needed something to fill up their ships with. And so they would swing here or there to the right port and load up with salt and bring it back to the colonies. And this is all good because the mother country, England, depended upon the livelihood of the colonies, and the colonies had to have salt. Without salt, they would be in bad straits. As a matter of fact, at the time of the Revolution, when we were so aggravated here in the colonies, when the British instigated the heavy taxes on all commodities, salt was the only one that was exempt. They never taxed salt. If they did, they destroyed the fishing industry, and they would destroy the livelihood of the colonies. And so salt came over from Europe by the, as I say, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of bushels. And actually this worked very well until, as you can very easily see, 1775, the Revolution. Revolution, of course, all trade stopped, all salt stopped. And the colonies, we were very dependent, as I've been saying, on that salt to preserve our food. The amount of salt that was used to season food didn't even hold a candle to what we're talking about, as I outlined with the salting of the fish, just from one vessel, 2,000 bushels a year of what was needed to preserve the foodstuffs. So suddenly here we were, if I can say it, high and dry with no salt. So what were we going to do? Well, we were going to have to make our own one way or another, and the various colonial governments stepped up to see what they could do. And many of them, like the General Court of Massachusetts, offered a 3-shilling bounty to anyone who would make salt. 3 shillings a bushel. If you'd make salt, they'd give you a bounty, plus what you could sell it for, they'd automatically give you a 3-shilling bounty. And this sort of practice was followed by the Virginia Convention, and Maryland, and both North and South Carolina. In New Jersey, they offered 6 pence for the bushel of salt. abounding. The Congress of New York did the same thing. The Connecticut Assembly. See, we all had our own different little governments in our colonies. And as a matter of fact, the shortage of salt became so acute that in 1779, the Quartermaster General of George Washington's army said, if we don't get salt, I cannot guarantee the army that you're going to need to fight the British. We also get a mention here from John Adams, who went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1777 and found that salt was selling for $27. Of course, these would be continental dollars, which, as we know, weren't worth a damn, but for $27 a bushel. Plus, he noticed that the streets of Philadelphia were empty, and he found a woman, and he said, "Where is everybody?" And she said, "They're down to the seashore trying to make salt." So salt was much sought after. Okay, let's come closer to home now and see what's happening. And we go down to Dennis, right here on the Cape. And in 1776, first year of the Revolutionary War, Captain John Sears, whether he's related to Sears and Roebuck, I don't know, but Captain John Sears thought, well, if we need to evaporate salt water and we can't evaporate it on the ground in marshes, why not build a vat to put it in, a wooden vat, which was no great challenge because everybody in those days was either a carpenter or a shipbuilder in one way or another. And so he made himself a crude vat and then carried buckets of water up and put it in, and sure enough, within 2 weeks, he had made 8 bushels of salt. That's not a lot of salt, but it was a start, and it certainly wasn't going to solve the situation. And of course, again, it was back-breaking work. He didn't have to cut wood because he was using the sun, but he had to carry all that water by hand in buckets. I'm sure he had some help one way or another. 350 gallons, remember, to make 1 bushel of salt. Then in 1778, the British man-of-war Somerset went ashore down off the Orleans bars, and the big bilge pump was salvaged. And Sears got hold of that, and with the aid of his buddies, they were able to set it up at the water's edge, and probably in a marshy area where they weren't fighting the waves, and pump the water through troughs into the vat. Well, this was a great boom, but it still required men to work the pump. And then somebody came along, and his name was Nathaniel Freeman from Harwich, and I don't know whether I'm related to him or not, but my middle name is Freeman, Seth Mendell. But anyway, Nathaniel Freeman came along, and he said, well, you know, the Dutch, very interestingly, the Dutch use windmills to pump the water out of their fields and into their into their dikes and keep their land dry. So why don't we use windmills to pump water up into these vats? And so that's the way it got started. They hooked up a crude pump up and down to an off-centered axle with a windmill with sails, and they could pump the water. And then another bright person came along by the name of Hallett Kelly in 1793, and he said, you know, we could speed up this evaporation process if we could keep the vats dry. You know, when it rained fresh water into what had already been evaporated. He said, why not make some roofs? Put some roofs over it, movable roofs, so that you could cover the vat up in the bad weather, or even at night to keep the dew out, and the daytime with the sun, you would open up the vats and let the sun evaporate the water. And so the salt works process was born in this manner. And the standard type of salt works was what they called a crane of works. And it was a series of 4 vats placed in a square, 4 vats, 12 feet by 12 feet. 12 feet seemed to be the right size because you could handle 12-foot lumber easily, and it was a desirable working measurement. And so you made your vat 12 feet by 12 feet, and of course the bottom was planked up, and as I say, you were a carpenter or a boat builder, so you knew how to cork it so it would hold the water, and the planks on the edge were 12 inches high so that you could get 11 or 12 inches of water over a 12 by 12 square. And so you had 4 of these, and then you had a pole up the middle. And this is why it was called a crane. And on the top of that crane, you put you crossed 2 timbers like this. And hanging down from each end of the 4 was a pyramid-shaped roof. And it was 12 by 12 at the bottom, right? So you can get the picture. It's all up on a spindle. One man can grab the edge and spin it off the vat. Down comes the sun, evaporates. At night he runs over, pulls it back around, and the vats are covered. And this certainly worked very well. Now, of course, it goes without saying, as the whole process developed, they developed larger vats, and sometimes they didn't swing the roofs, they rolled them on rollers. But basically, the types that we have right here in this side of Buzzards Bay were these cranes of roofs. All right, now these vats also were located up on posts. People think when you say salt works, oh, well, they've got to be down in the marsh. Well, the opposite is true. We're talking about evaporation here. We don't want them in a damp place. We want them in a dry place. And so they would be up on the land, and they'd be up on posts 2 to 4, 5 feet off the ground. So there'd be good ventilation all around them. Now, that was the physical setup. Now we've got to get into the nitty-gritty. If you take seawater, and as you know from a child, when you were swimming, if you drank that seawater, and your mother always told you not to, you don't feel very well. And you know, they always tell men that are shipwrecked in the Navy or wherever, don't drink the salt water. So you're off your rocker. You don't know what you're doing. In other words, there are impurities in that salt water. Excuse me. As a matter of fact, there are 50 different elements and compounds and chemicals in seawater, only one of which is our salt, NaCl. And so it goes without saying that if you just took that 350 gallons of seawater straight and took the salt from it, it's got all the same impurities in it. And it did. And if you did preserve your food with it, it might work for a short time, but over a long period of time, and we were talking 5 months here a few minutes ago, and of course, when they, in the maritime industry, when they used to go out on the whale ships and the merchantmen, they would have casks of meat that would last 4 to 5 years. You had to have pure salt. And so how did you get the pure salt? Well, here's what you did. And I don't know who developed the system. I never really found out, but it was used in Europe, and it was used here by our salt makers. You took your 4 vats, and they weren't all on the same level. Okay? Number 1 vat was the higher, 2 vat was lower, 3 vat lower, 4th vat was the lowest. And they were hooked together by troughs with gates, so that you could fill up your number 1 trough, and then you could pull a gate and it would drain down in number 2. Okay, and the windmill. Then you had your windmill down on the seashore, or pumping water out of the marsh or river or wherever you might be. You wouldn't want a river because it would have fresh water in it, but someplace where you could get your salt water. So your windmill pumped up the water into your number 1 vat, and it sat in that vat for almost a week. And like a vegetable growth would go along the edges of the vat, a slime, a leafy thing, looked like cabbage. And if you've walked around the marsh, you've seen it. It's a growth that comes with stagnant salt water. And so as soon as the salter, as he was called, sees this growth, he immediately lets that water, raises the gate, and lets that water down into vat number 2. And then he proceeds immediately to clean all that matter, that's growing matter, out and throw it away, and immediately fills that vat up, so that process can start again. The water now that has come down into vat number 2, which is called the lime room. All right, the first vat is called the slime room, because that's what we had, all that vegetation that grew around the edges, the slime room. The second vat is known as the lime room. And the water in the lime room now, you wait till it has reduced. You probably lost a couple of inches to the evaporation in vat 1. Now you lose a couple more inches in vat 2. Now here's what's happening. If you take a volume of this salt water, right, just like we have here in the harbor and the bay, it has all 50 of those minerals and chemicals in solution. All right? If you reduce the volume of the solution, there are some of those minerals and compounds that can't hang on anymore. There's not enough water. And so they precipitate out. In other words, they join together and fall down to the bottom. And this is why the vat number 2 is called the lime room. And the first compound or salt to precip out of our diminishing volume of water is called glaberite or calcite. And it's a very coarse salt. It's the kind of salt that's used to hold dust down on roads. It was also used in tanning of hides, byproduct, so to speak. All right. After, as I say, another 3 or 4 days, and the water has gone down in the vat, it's drained. He pulls the gate, and he drains down now into the 3rd vat, and this is called the pickle room. The pickle room because the brine now is very concentrated and very, very clear. If you go down to the Bahamas and the Caribbean, the water is exceptionally clear. Why is that? Because it's very concentrated brine, whereas up here in the north, our water isn't as clear because it's holding on to more of these minerals and compounds. At any rate, in the pickle room, as the volume decreases now, the next group of salts that form and drop out are Epsom salts. Epsom salts, the same Epsom salts you can go over here to Walgreens and buy, or CVS that you put in the bathtub and soak yourself in. Epsom salts. Then when the salt, and you can tell when that happens because suddenly the bottom of your vat is covered in white, as it had been with the glaberite or the calcite in vat number 2. So as soon as the salter sees this is vat number 3 now, he opens the door, the gate, and drains the water down into what's called the salt room. And the salt room is the last room, and you've only got now maybe 3 or 4 inches of water. It's very, very clear. There's never any more growth around the edges because there's such a saline solution. And when that water gets down to about 2 inches, all of a sudden it's like watching a snowstorm. The NaCl joins together in crystals and just falls to the bottom like a snowstorm. And the salter waits, the water gets down to 1 inch, and then he drains it off. And that's just, it's a throwaway. It's called bittern water. It still has impurities in it, and it's no good, but the salt, we've captured the pure NaCl. It was for example, the salt weighed about 75 to 80 pounds to a bushel. Imported salt, or salt from boiling, weighed only 56 pounds because there were so many impurities in it that were lighter than the regular salt. So this was the key to making the salt, and it took about 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the time of year, to run the water from vat 1 all the way down to vat 4. But remember, it was a continuing process. There was never an empty vat. So there was always another stream of water to come into vat number 4 to get your salt. Now, people have said to me, how do you know this works? Well, I know it works because I ran an experiment to see if it would work. And as I may have said in an earlier lecture, I was teaching at the time down at Avon Old Farm School in Avon, Connecticut. And so up on top of one of the buildings, the gym roof as a matter of fact, which is big and flat, I got myself, actually they were kitty litter pans, all right? And I did the same thing. I got my 4, and I drove up here to Mattapoisett and got myself 5 gallons of five 1-gallon jugs of Mattapoisett harbor water. And I went back to Connecticut and I filled up my first kitty litter thing, basket. And sure enough, for 3 or 4 days, I had that slime around it. Poured in the next one, and cleaned that up, poured in another gallon in the other one. I was going to keep it going. And sure enough, I got my calcite, a glaberite, and I poured it down, and sure enough, I came out with the salts just as they said. And I made myself roofs. Actually, I didn't have 4 little roofs. I just had a big roof I could put over the top. It worked well, and I had a lot more salt than, this is just to give you some flavor, but this was the Epsom salts. There it is, right out of Mattapoisett Harbor. And this was the actual salt. Now, as I say, I've had more, but I've lost some here and there. But that is the actual salt right out of Mattapoisett Harbor, and it's big, beautiful. It's what you call kosher salt, great big crystals, and it is. It's very salt. So I knew that it worked. Now, where did we have salt works? Well, here in Mattapoisett, well, let me preface it this way. Mattapoisett was shipbuilding, and so salt making really was a second industry, so to speak. A man would own a shipyard, but he'd also own a salt works. And so we had about 5 or 6 salt works, but not large. Now in a minute I'll talk about Marion. Now Marion had about 20 different salt works, because they have a shallow harbor. It was not a big shipbuilding, and they had salt works that ringed the entire harbor, point to point. But here in Mattapoisett, where we are right now, over on the neck, out from Molly's Cove, were the works of Leonard Hammond. Leonard Hammond, if you remember my lecture from last month, he had a shipyard as well. Then on what was called Minister's Island, which is from Molly's Cove down to the mouth of the Mattapoisett River, were the works of Lazarus LeBaron. He had salt works there. And then on Goodspeed's Island, probably was the biggest, where Jabez Goodspeed, it bears his name today, had his works on the Goodspeed's Island, which is that whole section, of course, from the Eel Pond right out here down to Camp Massasoit. That was all his salt works there, and he drew the water, of course, right out of the harbor. And he lived right along Main Street here, so he could tend his salt works. Here in the village, and by the village we mean where the town hall is, all along through here, and up by Mahoney's Lane. These works belong to Josiah Holmes and Gideon Barstow. Also, they were 2 shipyard owners, as you may recall. So there were salt works right here in in the village. And then out on Ned's Point, we had the works of Hiller Salt Works, and William Hiller, and down in Arcoop Cove, Isaac Hiller had his salt works. Now, as I say, in Marion there were some 20 works that ringed the harbor. I don't know as we need, well, I'll mention some of the names, and particularly if you are in Marion, you'll recognize them. There was Ebenezer Holmes. He had his works at the Landing in Marion. Bradford Bartlett, Stephen and Seth Hammond, John Clapp, Dean Clapp, David Hiller. Out on Great Neck, you had the works of Seth Blankenship and Stephen Delano. And right in the village, at the head of the harbor, the works of Captain Hammond. And there was, I say, about 20 different works. And a man by the name of George Bowman Nye in Marion would load his wagon up with salt each year, each spring, and drive up to Vermont, where he would sell the salt and bring back or trade it with a wagon load of butter and cheese. So the salt industry was never a large industry right in this particular area. But let me give you some figures to show you where it was more of a major business. As I say, the reason it really got started was that the Revolutionary War blockade with no shipping. We no longer imported the salt, but once the Revolutionary War was over, trade recommenced, and of course there was more salt being brought into the country again. So the salt industry kind of went back and forth. The War of 1812, you see, they put the embargo up again. The salt industry was in great demand. But here are some figures. The township of Rochester, which of course included Marion and Mattapoisett, there were a total of some 30 works, and in a year's time they made 32,500 bushels. All right, here in Rochester, in a year's time, they made 32,500 bushels. In Dartmouth, just the other side of New Bedford, there were 23 different works, and they made 28,000 bushels. In Barnstable County now, and this is where they really made the salt, down on the Cape. In Barnstable County, there were 668 works, and they made a total of 669,000 bushels of salt. So there was a much bigger industry down there on the Cape, and of course the demand, the fishing industry, there was good, very good market for it as well. Falmouth, and you see the thing about Barnstable, like Dennis on the Cape and Falmouth, is that they had two seacoasts, right? You had Cape Cod Bay on the one side, and or Vineyard, Nantucket Sound on the other. And in the case with Falmouth, you had Buzzards Bay on one side and Vineyard Sound on the other. Falmouth had 139 works, and they made 200,000 bushels of salt a year. But just to show you that it was a small industry, at the same time we were importing 6 to 8 million bushels of salt. So we have tremendous demand for salt. Now, I ought to tell you, one of the problems that with our solar salt evaporation process was that it took so long to make the salt, the whims of the weather, even with our shutters and all of that. And they tried to hasten it up. And so this is an interesting little story here that actually worked quite well. And they did it both in New Bedford and in Dartmouth and Pagnera. And they built what was called the Bushworks. The Bushworks. And the reason it was called Bushworks was that they took and built these immense frames of timbers that would run the length of a football field, for example. And they'd be maybe 10 feet wide and 30 feet high, 30 or 40 feet high. And they took and put windmills up at the top, and they had windmills that would pump the salt water up into containers at the bottom, and then the windmills would pump the water up to the top of this structure, and then there were troughs that ran the length of the top, and the water would drain into those troughs, which had lots of little holes, and the water would drip down through there. All right, now the reason they were called Bushworks was that, excuse me a minute, the reason they were called Bushworks was that they went out and cut a lot of oak brush that grows, you know, in the woods. And in the winter with the leaves off, it's, it's brush. It's what we call brush, bushes. And they take it and bundle it and tie it up all in this framework, layer after layer after layer after layer. So then when the windmills pumped your salt water up, and it pumped it along, and it drained down, and it had to run over all of these twigs and little branches down into big catch basins at the bottom. And it was nice to do. They did it on Clark's Point in New Bedford, and over in Dartmouth as well. The southwest wind would blow through there, or the northwest wind in the wintertime, and it would evaporate, hasten the evaporation. So by the time that water got down to the bottom, and instead of taking 350 gallons of it, it would only take about half that much to make a bushel of salt, because it would have lost that much water, volume, so to speak, coming down. So with our 4 vats, maybe you'd already cut out, or you'd already cut out the first 2 vats in terms of time-wise. Then to get the impurities out, they took that water and they ran it into a series of vats, but not 4. It was already a much more condensed, heavier brine, and so it worked much more rapidly. But even with these inventions like this, these attempts to hasten it, there was no way that they could make enough salt to satisfy the needs of the country and of the fishing and actually the meat industry as well. For example, if you slaughtered a steer or a lamb or a pig, much like the fish, the meat was all cleaned and washed and then rolled in salt and then packed in a barrel and then unpacked and repacked and unpacked and repacked, and finally after the 3rd or 4th packing and fresh salt every time, it was good for 4 or 5 years. At any rate, what happened to this salt industry anyway? Well, it actually limped along all the way up until the Civil War. The last of the salt works went out of business. But what really brought the end to the solar salt industry here on our southeast coast of Massachusetts was the building of the Erie Canal. The building of the Erie Canal in 1825. And why was that? It was because by this time, after 1800s, we had gotten to Ohio, we had gotten to upper New York State, and they did the same thing they did in jolly old England. They pumped water, or ran a stream down into a pit, deeper and deeper, and pumped up a very concentrated brine, which they put into kettles and boiled. But then, before they boiled it all the way down, they ran it out into vats and used the vat process to get rid of the impure salts, and so they were coming up with a very good salt suitable for the curing of foodstuffs. The only big problem had been, how do you get that bulk salt from Ohio or upper New York State down to the fishing industry on the coast? Well, Erie Canal. Built the Erie Canal, and sure enough, down would come the salt by boat, by barge, by vessel, down to where the market was. And so with our own inland salt now and our imported salt, and of course I'm not going into the political overtures here, our salt makers in the United States wanted a tariff, a high tariff, to protect their industry, so imported salt would cost more. And then of course the people who needed the salt said, heck with that, no tariff, we don't want to pay too much for that salt. Then of course, then what happened was the railroad. The railroad came along. And as Samuel Eliot Morrison, a renowned historian, said, some smart Yankee came along and combined ice, fish, and the railroad. In other words, with rapid transportation now that you could always depend upon, you could pack your fish in ice, put it on a railroad, ship it 50 miles, would be there in the morning, and you'd have fresh fish. And so gradually this tremendous need for salt to preserve foodstuffs began to diminish and dwindle away. But salt making was an active little, what you might call a cottage industry, particularly in this section of southeastern Massachusetts. And it was a very necessary one when it took place because of the great need brought about by the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. We had to have salt, we had to make our own salt, and the only means we had was salt water and the good old sun and evaporation. So the salt makers of Cape Cod, their ingenuity, put together this system, and they made very good salt. Thank you very much.